Greetings. Brother Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy and the modern world, moving into the reign of Pope 243, Clement the 11th, who reigned from 1700 to 1721, so the turn of the century and the first pope of the 18th century. Sorry about that. The conclave of 1700 argued for 46 days before settling on a compromise candidate, a Zelanti, or as today would say a conservative, who had been made a cardinal by Innocent XII. His baptismal name was Giovanni Francesco Albani, Albani. He accepted election on November 23rd, 1700, taking the name Clement the 11th to take that name, and reigned as Pope 243 for 21 years. The Pontificate of Clement the 11th was dominated by the War of the Spanish Succession. We did the setup for that at the end of the last pontificate. And it was, the war ended up engulfing all of Europe. It lasted for 13 years, 1701 to 1714. The war was precipitated by the death of Carlos II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, who had no children, and had named as his heir, the first guy named died before he did, so the second one he named as his heir was a grandson of Louis XIV, King of France. This would make, and that grandson was Philip, the Duc d'Anjou, and who became, just to anticipate things, he became King Philippe V of Spain, reigned from 1700 to 1746. And was the first of the House Bourbon to hold that title, King of Spain. In a number of ways, this war was simply in continuity with the previous European conflicts. Warfare between France and Austria had been taking place for centuries when France was ruled by the Valois, and now it continued when it's ruled by the Bourbons. The War of the Spanish Succession was also another of the countless dynastic wars precipitated because royalty and aristocrats only want to marry other royalty and other aristocrats. And since that had been going on for centuries, it gave all the houses legitimate claim because of intermarriage. It gave them all some claim on each other's thrones. The outcome of the war would directly affect the Papal States because at the time Spain ruled Milan in northern Italy as well as Naples in southern Italy, with the Papal State in between. The outcome of the war would also affect many other regions because at the time Spain also ruled the island of Sicily, the Balearic Islands, and Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, as well as parts of the Netherlands, Belgium, today present-day Belgium, as well as the Americas, their territory in Mexico, Central America, South America. When the war was waged, the two sides were, on one side, France, Spain, Portugal, Bavaria, and Savoy. The other side was Austria, Germany, the Dutch Netherlands, Great Britain. Dozens of battles and 250,000 deaths filled the subsequent 13 years. The most historically interesting fact about this time is that an ancestor of Winston Churchill, whose name was John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, earned his historical reputation for a series of important sieges and victories during this conflict. Pope Clement XI offered to mediate in the first year of the war, April 1701. Of course, he was ignored. In 1705, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Austrian Habsburg, Joseph I, conquered Naples in southern Italy, and occupied a portion of the Papal States, while Savoy invaded Milan in northern Italy and occupied the northern regions of the Papal States. So, you had Savoy stealing from the north and the Habsburgs stealing from the south. Still, Pope Clement maintained his strict neutrality, which is probably the only thing that prevented Rome itself from being stolen. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, to which Pope Clement was not invited because of his steadfast neutrality. Louis XIV of France won the right of his grandson to remain King of Spain. So he became Philip V of Spain. Yet Philippe had to swear that there would never be an attempt to unite France and Spain as a single country. Spain also retained its colonial possessions in the New World, but the Spanish colony in Europe, the Spanish Netherlands, at present-day Belgium, went to Austria, and the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean and Gibraltar at the entrance to the Mediterranean went to England. The territory stolen from the Papal State were just reallocated without consulting the Pope. Sicily, Sardinia, Piacenza, and Parma were just divided up. They were fiefs. While Piacenza and Parma were part of the Papal State, Sicily and Sardinia were fiefs of the Holy See. Sardinia, the island of Sardinia, was assigned to the Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, the dynasty that would eventually steal the Papal States from Pope Pius IX in 1860, and then steal Rome from the Pope in 1870. Pope Clement promulgated a bull rescinding the so-called Sicilian monarchy on February 20th, 1715, as being in violation of feudal law, but was ignored. In terms of teaching, Jansenism returns. All of the original antagonists from the first phase of Jansenism were dead. Now an entirely new generation had grown to adulthood without considering Jansenism as anything other than a problem of their parents' time. This changed by the irresponsible prying of academic theologians on the faculty of the Sorbonne in Paris, the background of which. In 1702, a pamphlet was published titled A Case of Conscience. Now, many such works were published, presenting a moral or spiritual dilemma as the basis for debate, either in open forum or in a pamphlet form, inviting others to respond. The topic of this case of conscience was whether or not sacramental absolution could be given to a penitent who remains silent on the fact of the 5 condemned propositions from Jansen's work. After an academic disputation, the faculty at the Sorbonne decided that the debate had been won by the affirmative, meaning that absolution could be granted to such a penitent. But the argument restarted the entire movement again. So all the old works were reread, all the debates were reopened. So this revived Jansenism as a thing for a new generation in the 18th century. Pope Clement could not allow this to go uncorrected, as parish priests were legitimately confused now as to how they were to proceed in confession. So the Pope issued a clarification in a papal bull titled Vineam Domini Sabaoth on July 15th, 1705. In which he condemned the decision of the Sorbonne, that one could reject, that a penitent could reject the fact of the five propositions condemned by Innocent X, while maintaining a respectful silence as to whether or not they occurred in Jansen's work. This renewal of an old conflict within the Church occurred during the War of the Spanish Succession, in which Holland, the birthplace of Jansen himself, Cornelius Jansen, was fighting against France. So King Louis XIV gave the Pope his total support this time, and then one of those accidents which changed history occurred. One of Louis XIV's armies, the French army, fighting in the Netherlands, occupied territory which brought into their hands a vast correspondence, a chest full of letters. From studying them, it became clear that Jansenism, though not publicly discussed over the previous 4 decades, had many in France who still adhere to it. Its morality, spirituality, ecclesiology, and political philosophy. Among them, as revealed in the captured documents, was a rather famous French Catholic priest and Oratorian named Pasquier Quenal, Q-U-E-S-N-E-L, who lived from 1634 to 1719. In 1692, he published a work titled Moral Reflections on the New Testament. It was a bestseller, especially among parish clergy. It circulated for 16 years and went through many editions because it was well written. It combined an understandable, comprehensible commentary on the New Testament with moral and spiritual advice, designed for use by priests who actually were dealing with the faithful. It called to a devout and austere spirituality for clergy and laity alike. Virtually no one who read it even thought of Jansenism, which had been condemned and thought forgotten by the Clementine Peace of 1669. It's Clement IX, 40 years earlier. Well, now it was exposed, and King Louis XIV demanded that the Pope take action. On July 13, 1708, Clement XI, after reviewing the work, Moral Reflections, he condemned it as being based on a corrupted interpretation of the New Testament. On September 8, 1713, Clement XI issued a bull, Unigenitus Dei Filius, which translates Only Born Son of God, which extracted 101 propositions from Quenal's work and condemned them as heretical. 4 bishops, who obviously had Jansenist sympathies, appealed this decision, appealed to a church council, said that this condemnation was unjust, and said, so they appealed to a church council for justice against the Pope. For a change, Louis XIV sided with the Pope because he perceived the Jansenists as a threat, because the origin of the heresy was in Holland, with which he was generally at war, as he was at the moment. Pope Clement excommunicated these 4 bishops who appealed on August 28, 1718. And King Louis XIV forced the courts in France and imposed it as an oath, acceptance of it as an oath. The 101 condemned propositions can be divided as follows. 43 of them dealt with the doctrinal elements of Jansenism regarding grace and predestination. 31 of them dealt with the moral aspects of Jansenism, that good works are not possible for those who are not predestined for salvation. 7 represented Richerist theology, that the laity should have a role in direct governance of the church, ordinary governance of the church. And another 7 argued that the church existed as an independent, divinely instituted reality apart from the hierarchy. And the hierarchy of the church was just a purely human institution. So I'll condemn that. So Unigenitus, it was part of it, but so Jansenism is revived again, and Unigenitus revived the old Jansenist alliance, but in a new generation, between doctrinal Jansenist, spiritual Jansenist, Gallicans, that's the National Church people, Richerist parish clergy, anti-monarchical political ideologues, and journalists who were loving this because they could publish all this conflict and sell more newspapers and more pamphlets. King Louis XIV became so enraged that he even had the 3,000 corpses in the old cemetery of the Port Royal convent dug up and thrown into a common pit. Jansenism was still not finished doing its damage, but for the remainder of this pope's reign, it continued to generate mountains of publications, and which leading to episodes of public disorder. Otherwise, in terms of sanctification, Pope Clement XI declared a feast of the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady to be mandatory throughout the Catholic world in 1708. As we covered earlier in the early modern period, Pope Sixtus IV first allowed it as a feast, but initially just in Spain, because that's who asked for it, in 1476. But in 1708, Clement XI raised it, so now the Universal Church had to acknowledge it. Other developments had a foreign antecedents, but still was intrinsic to the church because it dealt with missiology. And this was specifically a revival of the Chinese rites controversy, in this case meaning liturgical rites, R-I-T-E-S. It resurfaced in Clement's reign because of the persistent accusations made by Dominicans and Franciscans against the Jesuits, that Jesuits were allowing pagan syncretism in their Chinese missions. Pope Clement, in response, forbade the use of the Chinese rites on November 20th, 1704, which, you recall, had initially been condemned, but then were permitted again by Pope Alexander VIII. So now in 1704, Clement forbade them again. Then the Jesuits appealed this new condemnation, and even obtained a letter from the Emperor of China, Kangxi, stating that the Confucian ancestor rituals were civic practices rather than religious actions, that the ancestor rites were not worshiping the ancestors as if they were divinities. He still, but and they presented this to Clement, trying to get him to reverse his condemnation, but he said no, he was not persuaded. So he reiterated the condemnation of the Chinese rites on March 19th, 1715. In response, the Emperor of China, Kangxi, ruled that foreign missionaries could only remain in China if they received a license from him, and that licenses would only be granted to those who followed the adaptationist model of the late Jesuit Matteo Ricci. In other words, those missionaries who used the Chinese rites. Within 11 years, the same emperor Kangxi, simply expelled all foreign missionaries, as in that time he grew fatigued with the bickering between the Jesuits on one side and the Dominicans and Franciscans on the other. So he just threw them all out. The Chinese rites remained forbidden, even though it was academic by that point, but remained forbidden until Pope Pius XII in 1939 permitted them again. But by then, China was only a decade away, actually less than a decade, 8 years away from the abyss, from being taken over by the communists, which of course were atheists. King Louis XIV ruled over France for 72 years, the longest reign in European history up to that point. It came to an end, meaning he died, during the Pontificate of Clement XI on September 1st, 1715. During his reign, Louis XIV was the chief disturber of the peace of Europe, and he was never a friend to the Church unless it suited his personal interest. He outlived so many of his heirs that his successor, Louis XV, was actually his great-grandson. Louis XV reigned from 1715 to 1774, dying just over a decade. Let's see, about 15 years before the French Revolution. Pope Clement XI died on March 19, 1721, after a reign of 20 years and 4 months. He was followed by the 3-year reign of Pope Innocent XIII, to whom we will turn in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.